for listening to At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. I'm Gary Pounder. Today on the program, an update on the war in Ukraine. You may recall about 6 weeks ago we were joined by two experts on European politics and history for their assessment on where the conflict was headed during the early stages of the war. Well, today we're proud to welcome them back to the podcast. Dr. Tatiana Rizova and Dr. Mazzarella will again share their thoughts and insights on the war and offer some insights on what may be coming next as the conflict enters a new phase with a massive Russian offensive now underway in the Donbas region of Ukraine. Can the Russians still achieve a victory? Can the Ukrainians sustain the heroic resistance that prevented the Russians from taking their capital city earlier in the spring? And how should the West support the Ukrainians as they continue to battle the Russians? A current look at the war in Ukraine coming up today on At Ease. But first, here's some troubling numbers. Did you know that up to 1/3 of military spouses are unemployed or underemployed? And did you know that almost 40% of those men and women have talked to their military husband or wife about getting out of the military to help them improve their job prospects? Well, those were two of the findings from recent research by Burning Glass and the organization Hiring Our Heroes. And you better believe those numbers have an impact on military readiness and national security. If a military family needs 2 paychecks and the spouse can't find a good job, well, the service member is going to be less effective because he or she is worried about, first of all, their economic situation, and second of all, the well-being of their spouse. Well, fortunately, the news isn't all bad. There are actually a variety of programs aimed at helping military spouses develop skills and helping them land a good job. And at Thomas Nelson, we're proud to be part of that solution. We're a member of the military's My Career Advancement Account program, or MyCAA. It's aimed at spouses of military members in pay grades E1 through E5, W1 and W2, and O1 and O2. The program provides up to $4,000 over 2 years, can be used for almost any type of education and training program, and that helps military spouses develop skills that can lead to a better job. And better yet, MyCAA focuses on portable job skills so that military spouses can more easily land a new job when their spouse moves on to a new assignment in the U.S. military. Learn more about the MyCAA program at Thomas Nelson by calling the military team at 757-825-2938 or email me at pounderg@tncc.edu. That's pounderg, Pounderg, @tncc.edu. Mastering new job skills as a military spouse? Well, it's closer than you think at Thomas Nelson, becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College. For today's update on the conflict in Ukraine, we're joined again by two noted experts on the region. First of all, Dr. Tatiana Rizova is an associate professor of political science at Christopher Newport University in Newport News. She holds a PhD in that field from UCLA. She's also a native of Eastern Europe and a recognized expert on the region and its various issues. And we're also joined by her colleague, Dr. Mazzarella, Emeritus Professor of History at CNU. He holds a PhD from American University, and he taught European history at CNU for more than 40 years. So Dr. Mazzarella, Dr. Rizova, thank you so much again for joining us and taking time to share your insights and knowledge again here on the podcast. It's funny. In prepping for the podcast here today, I went back and listened to the conversation we had back on the 4th of March. And I think at that time, the consensus was the Russians probably still had enough combat power to grind it out and achieve their military goals in Ukraine and maybe even take Kyiv. We also thought at that time Ukraine's defensive efforts would begin to transition from conventional warfare toward an insurgency campaign. And I'm trying to figure out, were we just completely off the mark in those predictions or that assessment back then, or maybe just a little bit ahead of schedule, because now we have the Russians launching a major offensive in the Donbas area. There are some questions about the ability of the Ukrainians to hold on in that region. So looking back, how do you think we did in terms of the assessment that we were providing way back on the 4th of March. And I'll start with you, Dr. Rizova.
Hello, Gary, and hello to our audience. I think to some extent our predictions were accurate, and to some extent probably not so accurate. I do think that there were some miscalculations on behalf of the Russian high command and on behalf of Putin, of course. Originally, when the invasion began, my prediction was that perhaps Russia would begin with Donbass rather than head straight for Kiev. And that wasn't really the case. So first of all, that expectation, that prediction on my behalf wasn't entirely accurate. The miscalculation on behalf of the Russian high command was that Kiev would be easy to take over, which did not turn out to be the case. I think there was definitely a misunderstanding of just how united Ukrainians would be and how much of a defense they would be able to marshal. And of course, we should also take into consideration the help that Ukraine has been receiving from the West as well. The military assistance, all of these packages, I think, at the end of the day, help the Ukrainian forces mobilize successfully. And of course, they love their homeland. So that is also very important.
Absolutely. Dr. Mazzarella, your take on where we are in the conflict right now and how events have played out versus how you thought they would play out back when we talked previously in early March.
Yes, well, I was more pessimistic than Dr. Rizova. I thought, given the sheer mass of the Russian effort, and of course, at that moment, the unproven nature of what resistance Ukrainians could mount, I had very bad feelings about the whole situation. I was delightedly surprised by quite unexpected turns of events. What you asked me here seems like it goes into your question about how this first phase of the war has gone. In their initial campaign, the Russian military violated several of the principles of war which govern U.S. military thinking. There's an acronym you probably know, MOS.
Yes.
Abbreviation for that. I learned this way back in our TC back 60 years ago. But they violated several of those principles. The principle of unity of command was violated. No, there was no overall commander. Apparently, it was split in different areas, as if there were different theaters of operation, and the result was confusion. As Napoleon said, one bad commander is better than two good ones. Well, and it was certainly so in this case. You cannot have a hydra-headed monster trying to govern an army. That doesn't work. Another was the principle of mass, and connected to that is the principle of objective. Russian forces were not concentrated on one objective. They scattered their forces and attacks all over the place. They wanted Kyiv, they wanted Kharkiv, they wanted the Donbass. The result was that this is probably due to them believing their own propaganda that the Ukrainians were going to welcome them with open arms. Well, the Ukrainians, in fact, did welcome them with arms, but they weren't open arms. They were military arms. Then surprisingly, given the amount of money that's been poured into the Russian military in the last 10 years, the bad training of their troops, and the lack of good leadership and initiative at the lower officer and non-commissioned officer level, which results in generals having to go forward to give orders that should have been given at the lower level, which the result of this, of course, as we know, is that five Russian generals have been killed. They shouldn't have been anywhere near those areas where they were by any rights. On the Ukrainian side, on the other hand, they've employed marvelous tactics of small units swarming larger ones, picking off Russian tanks and Russian units. This is aided marvelously by this informal intelligence service, if you will, which they call the Babushka group, grandmothers and kids with iPhones telephoning in where Russian positions and tanks are. And the Ukrainian forces can respond to that kind of thing. So if they will, they have eyes all over the place. They have an Argus, many-eyed monstrosity as far as the Russians are concerned, spying on the Russian small directors saying, hey, look here, hey, they're going there. And then finally, so they hit them with drones and artillery. And finally, to repeat Napoleon again, in war, the moralists of the material as 3-1. The Ukrainians are deeply motivated to fight furiously, and the Russians much less so. And all this has gone, in fact, into the situation that we have seen up to this point.
And on that note, I know you're fond of saying that historians are very good at predicting what happened in the past. It's very obvious that Ukraine won the first phase of this war. When historians, military historians, write the history of the Ukrainian-Russian war in 2022, how much do you think they will chalk this up to poor planning and even incompetence by the Russians, and how much is the result of really firm resistance, innovative tactics, innovative ways of collecting and using intelligence by the Ukrainians?
I definitely think that it's a little bit of both. If I were to assess which one of those two sets of factors may have played a larger role, I would definitely argue that Ukraine's defensive efforts have been far superior to the offensive efforts of the Russians.
And I think that is a very, very fair assessment. And I think one of the questions that's going to be asked as well, and this is something that is more of an issue for smart people at three-letter agencies in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, Belgium, places like that. Some of the issues, Dr. Mazzarella, that you raised a moment ago about the Russian military, the lack of competent leadership at the lower levels among the NCO Corps and among the junior officers. And in fact, the Russian Army really doesn't have a professional NCO Corps the way that the U.S. military does. That takes a very important role in a conflict like this because, again, in a Western Army, it's the NCOs who are the backbone. They're the ones that make sure the troops are fed, that they're equipped, that they're trained, that they understand their assignment, and they're there to make sure that the orders are carried out. The Russians really don't have that. And again, their junior officers, unlike junior officers in the U.S. and other Western militaries, are really not encouraged to take the initiative to assess the situation and then do what has to be done, even if it means deviating from the original plan to some degree. And as you pointed out, that's why so many Russian flag officers wound up being killed by Ukrainian snipers, artillery barrages, because they're having to go forward and do things that would not be done by someone at their level in their in a U.S. military organization or a NATO military organization. And compare that with how the Ukrainians have conducted themselves in the campaign so far. And so I guess what I'm leading back to is the sense that we knew, that being American NATO intelligence, we knew about these problems in the Russian military to some degree. We've known about them for years. But yet in formulating the initial assessment, we still believed the Russians were going to be in Kyiv in 4 days. They were going to overrun the eastern half of the country in 14 days to 30 days. I guess my question is this: going forward, what lessons should folks in D.C. and the American intelligence community, in European intelligence communities, what lessons should they take from how the war has played out so far and their own initial expectations for the conflict?
Oh, that's a very good question. Your point, by the way, about the importance of the NCO Corps, for those of us who served in the military, like you and I have, I got compliments on the good job that I was doing. Take my sergeants out and everything would fall apart. So thank God for them. It's possible to overlearn. The Russians did a bad job on their initial stage of fighting against the Finns in 1940. But as Benjamin Franklin says, experience is an expensive school. If one's intelligent, one does learn from it. But because of their initial bad performance against the Finns, the Germans thought, good heavens, they're a totally incompetent force. They will not be able to stand up against us. Well, that proved not to be the case, although it took some another year of hard combat before the Russians learned sufficiently to go. So I would be careful with we overestimated the Russian military. I wouldn't underestimate them. I think that's always a mistake. One of the things I read about training is that the Russians, for instance, have no training in urban warfare. We have mock cities and villages that we put our troops to training in how to, secure such positions and whatnot. They had none of this. Apparently, they were only trained in one thing, fighting in the open and whatnot. And when they ran into a city, they're stymied. I think we ought to learn, however, that dependence in the modern age, and we should have learned this to some degree in Afghanistan, dependence on heavy units, units with heavy equipment and whatnot, may not be the best way to handle atrocities like this. You think we would have learned this lesson, and perhaps we have, from what happened in Vietnam, where we had an overwhelming preponderance of power, but we could not win the war. A book was written, I can't remember the author's name, but he was one of the people who was negotiating with the North Vietnamese towards the end of the war. And he became fed up at one point. In exasperation, he looked across at his North Vietnamese counterpart and said, you never defeated us in the field. The North Vietnamese officer replied, that is correct. And it's also irrelevant. There are some victories that are not worth winning. So I think we ought to, whatever losses we have learned in Vietnam and in Afghanistan and whatnot, we ought to be thinking about as we see what's going on here. Now, things may change. The Ukrainians and the Russians have been fighting in the northern part of the country where there is forest land and hills and whatnot, and that lends itself to small unit tactics. But now the theater of war is moving to the east, where there are broad plains, which lends itself to more conventional forms of warfare, tank warfare, and heavy units. And a general in charge who, from his experience in Syria, has no qualms at all about using the maximum of violence to achieve its ends. What are the kind of tactics that the Ukrainians have used so successfully in the north can be employed against units deployed in this massive fashion? Once again, I don't know. We'll have to see. Some commentators I've read seem to think that it can't continue to be successful. I will have to wait and see again. I hope that they're right, but we'll have to wait and see whether that's the case.
And that leads me into my next question. We're talking again about the fact the war is now entering a new phase with a focus on the Donbass region, as you point out, much more friendly for maneuver warfare, open plains, better country for tanks, armored vehicles, more easy to spot targets for artillery, for rockets, for missiles, things like that. So with this new phase and the focus again on Donbass and also finally securing Mariupol and securing that corridor from Crimea overland to the Russian border, given what we've seen so far, but given the fact that we're now fighting in kind of a different environment, what do you see as being Russia's prospects for a military victory in this second phase of the war, Dr. Rizova?
So the Russian forces are definitely regrouping, and I think from a strategic standpoint, one of the things they are trying to accomplish is secure several victories, and victories that will be far easier to attain than their failed attempt in Kiev. Without that victory, there will certainly be a lot of damage to the morale of the Russian troops. And I would not be surprised if in the following phase of the military offensive, we're looking at movement away from Donbass. So in other words, if the Russian forces are able to conquer those cities in Donbass, they will probably expand the offensive perhaps further west, further south. And I would not be surprised if we see far more devastation than we have so far. So I think there's definitely a lot of enthusiasm and almost a desperation for a victory, because otherwise the morale of those troops will be severely undermined. I was reading some of the statistics about the number of soldiers who have deserted. And I'm talking about not conscripts, but soldiers who are actually hired to fight on behalf of Russia. And it looks like we're already going in the thousands. Of course, we'll never know the real numbers, but this is based on interceptions of communication among the Russian command. And the situation, in fact, is probably dire enough that the Russian Ministry of Defense created a special stamp in which it says that a soldier who refuses to go and fight in Ukraine that stamp is placed on their paperwork, and it says, prone to lies, deceit, and treason for refusing to fight in Luhansk, Donetsk, and Ukraine. So the situation is definitely going to be getting far worse in the absence of victory such as the one in Donbass. So I think there'll be an intensification because of that desire for wins.
And kind of a follow-up on that question for you, Dr. Mazzarella. The Russians have obviously shifted a lot of combat power to the Donbass region. In fact, many of the battalion technical groups that were fighting outside Kyiv, trying to encircle the Ukrainian capital, have now been moved down to Donbass. But we know those units took a real pounding from the Ukrainians. Many of them were actually combat ineffective when they left the area. Do you think the Russians have the ability to patch those units up and get them in the fight for them to actually make any kind of a difference, or are they still feeling the effects of their initial combat with the Ukrainians, where these units that are being shifted down from the Kyiv front are really not going to be much help in the campaign there in Donbass?
Well, again, an excellent question, and it gets farther than that. The siege of Mariupol right now, it looks like the city is bound to fall. It's down to one last strong point and whatnot. And there's sacrifice. Well, of course, the Russians will then be able to redeploy those troops to the Donbass. But those units, just as what you described coming from the north, have been very badly bled. So we're going to get no idea kind of the effectiveness out of them that might be expected. It's one thing to say, well, we moved the 2 battalions up there. Well, what's the strength of those battalions? The Russians seem to be suffering, and this seems shocking, a manpower problem. They don't seem to have enough troops to really handle the situation that's going on. I mean, I was astonished if they had to resort to obviously the Syrians to send volunteers. I'll bet they're volunteers. Anything about that. But why would they do this? They have a manpower problem, and if the Russians continue to win in the east, it could be that these victories could end up being Pyrrhic victories, where they bleed so much that the game is barely worth the candle. And this again could change the situation in ways which at this moment are unpredictable.
And that leads me to another point, Dr. Rizova, in the sense that the Russians do have these issues to contend with. There is indeed a manpower shortage. They're having to pull, as Dr. Mazzarella said, volunteers, air quotes, from Syria, from Chechnya. They're bringing in soldiers from the Far East Military District to try to flesh out these units that were hit, and bled so heavily in the initial fighting up around Kyiv. Given these factors and the fact that the Russian economy is being battered daily by the sanctions imposed by the West, what kind of a timetable do you think that Putin and his military actually have now for being able to achieve the goals they're trying to achieve in places like Donbass and down there in Mariupol?
I definitely think that this timetable has shrunk. I think that's inevitable, given the losses, given the devastation to the Russian economy. But by the way, the devastation to the Russian economy is not really affecting the elite. It is affecting the people. And we do have to bear in mind that Russian propaganda through state media is so potent that most people in Russia are probably convinced that the West is at fault rather than the Russian government. So we still have to contend with that factor of the powerful Russian state propaganda. The timetable has definitely shortened. However, one thing that I'm concerned about is if Russians did not secure victories, and if they're not able to take over more territory in Ukraine, how is that going to affect the power balance and then the prospect for use of chemical weapons or tactical nuclear weapons? So that is definitely a concern of mine.
And I'm glad you raised that point, because within the last 24 to 36 hours, both Ukrainian President Zelensky and his chief of military intelligence have been cautioning about the possibility of Russia resorting to using tactical nuclear weapons. The intelligence chief, for example, noted that Russia was observed conducting nuclear weapons handling drills in the Black Sea or the Black Sea Fleet before the conflict began. Given all the factors we've talked about before, the Russian shortened timetable for victory, what do you see as being the likelihood for potential WMD employment by the Russians, especially if things start to go bad in Donbass in the days and weeks ahead?
So before I respond to the question directly, I do want to mention that we're talking about events that are highly unlikely. However, having said that, as the success of conventional warfare declines or is less likely, the higher the temptation to use other types of weapons. So while the events are unlikely, I think the probability does increase somewhat if those victories are not secured. I do not think that Putin and his high-ranking military officials are the type of people who will refrain from using chemical weapons or tactical nuclear weapons. I think they have demonstrated just how worthless human life is in so many ways. They have not refrained from striking civilian infrastructure, buildings, killing children. So I will not be the person to give him the benefit of the doubt and say they will absolutely not resort to more lethal weapons. I think they will not think twice about it if the military conditions in their mind call for that use.
Well, you know, it's interesting because the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov, made comments earlier today that, in his words, the Russians have no plans to use nuclear weapons at this point, which, of course, leaves the option open, somewhere down the road, whether it be tomorrow, next week, next month, or whatever. On a related note there, we've also heard Vladimir Putin in recent days warning NATO that supplying ammunition, supplying military hardware to Ukraine could result in what he called unexpected consequences. Dr. Mazzarella, what do you think Putin means by that? And do you think he's actually serious about doing something in retaliation to NATO? And what form do you think that retaliation could take?
I think what Dr. Rizova's previous contribution was exactly on target here. But I heard Angela Stent this morning on a Foreign Affairs webinar make the comment, yes, he could use nuclear weapons, but to what end? A tactical nuclear weapon is something that you would use, is truly tactical, against, let us say, a large military unit where it could have devastating effect. But to use it against the kind of small hit and run units that the Ukrainians are using, it's kind of a, if you will, the waste of a hand grenade to kill a squirrel. It just doesn't. It doesn't seem to be to make any military sense in this case. Or it could make a demonstrative effect. Dr. Rizzo is absolutely correct. The Russians have shown absolutely no regard for human life, and it's not any moral consideration. It's just a practical one. Well, if you got the sledgehammer, well, what the hell am I going to use it? If we had an elephant to hit, that's one thing. But we got a swarm of wasps. Sledgehammers don't work very well against that. Now, as to your your question about what possible further actions he could take, given how badly they've done against the Ukrainians, somebody made the comment, I don't think that they'll be contemplating at this moment doing something like attacking the Baltics. This may not be something they want to get themselves involved in further here. They have demonstrated enough problems with their military already. And one thing they don't need to do is expand the areas of where they can demonstrate their incompetence. So I think there's been a bit of a relaxation, perhaps, in that regard. What else could they do? I really don't know. They could be harder even on the Ukrainian people that they encounter in order to create a kind of a, if you will, a hostage situation. Unless you unless you ease up on us, we're going to treat these people even worse. I suppose that's one thing they could do. But beyond that, I don't see that there's any way that Putin could do much more to hurt the West. He could cut off natural gas to Germany. That would certainly hurt.
Yeah.
And would wreck his economy even further. So that's like hitting yourself over the head with a hammer to make somebody else feel pain. It's not going to work very well. I don't really know what maybe Dr. Rizzo has an idea on the subject, but I don't know what more the Russians would threaten to do to us that would not be even worse for them.
Well, during our last conversation, we were talking and speculating about the possible use of cyber weapons by Russia against the West. Do you still see that as being a possibility, Dr. Rizova?
I absolutely do. And I would not be surprised if one of the possible ways of retaliating against the West for its support of Ukraine is precisely by targeting critical infrastructure in the United States and Western Europe and other parts as well. So I see that as a potential retaliation on behalf of Russia, along with the other types of retaliations, such as cutting off gas to Germany, in spite of the fact that Germany is trying to wean itself off. It's not a quick process. It's not as if you can do it overnight. This will take months at best. And the additional, of course, putting more pressure on Ukraine, causing more civilian deaths, and experimenting with other types of weapons. So frankly, I don't know what goes through Putin's mind when he makes threats like that. But one thing I do know is that these threats should be taken very seriously.
And I think that is a very, very safe assessment. Now, let's kind of, I guess, stay in the court of worst-case scenarios. Let's say that the campaign in Donbass does not go well. They suffer continued heavy casualties. They're not really gaining territory, achieving their tactical goals, their operational goals, even their strategic goals. And let's say he does go ahead and employ nuclear weapons, perhaps against something like an airfield, a fairly open target that you could take down with a fairly small nuke, inflict military damage without, necessarily causing a lot of civilian casualties, although it's very clear Mr. Putin has no regard for that at all. If the Russians do cross the nuclear threshold, what do you think the NATO response would be? What do you think it should be?
Well, if I could just add that Angela Stent heard her say this morning that the use of a tactical nuclear weapon would horrify and frighten the Europeans even more, and would probably lead them to do things in regards to sanctions that up to now they've not been willing to do. So that there's a backfire effect right there. So they can take out an airfield, as you pointed out. But is that really a big deal militarily? The geopolitical consequences are so severe for that. If you're going to pay for something, you better get what you paid for. The consequences of the Russians, once again, there's not much they can do. That's not going to come back at this point and hurt them even harder than their use of it.
I certainly think that the response should go beyond the sanctions that have currently been imposed on Russia. The Russian economy is never going to be completely cut off from the world. As we've already spoken in our previous conversation, the connection between Russia and China as trade partnership, and of course, the like-mindedness when it comes to undermining the power of the West is something to be kept in mind. One thing that also concerns me a little bit is that while there is unity among NATO members, there are some NATO members who are not really necessarily 100% on the same page as others. And the example that I'd like to bring up here is that of Hungary. As we know, President Putin essentially threatened everyone that if they wanted to buy gas, oil from Russia, they'll have to pay in rubles because of how severe the sanctions have been. And the leader of Hungary, Mr. Orban, was one of those individuals who said that he would be willing to pay Russia in rubles, and he has also demonstrated some sympathy and kind of closeness with Russia, as well as President Putin. So one thing that worries me a little bit is that we do still have state actors within NATO that may, to some extent, undermine the unitedness of the treaty organization.
Do
so
you see?
We have to worry about those as well. Yeah.
Do you see anything else beyond the relationship of Orban and Putin, for example? Any other factors that could cause NATO support for Ukraine to waver in the weeks and months ahead?
I think the unity is there. However, if, God forbid, it comes down to military action, that's when that unity is going to be really important. So while I do not see that even the government of Mr. Orban may shed some doubt on just how united NATO is, I would definitely want to see him put his money where his mouth is when it comes to that.
And Dr. Mazzarella, same question for you, sir. Do you see any events, any factors in the weeks and months ahead that could cause NATO support for Ukraine to begin to waver even a bit?
I see some important internal factors, domestic factors in the West. This morning's newspaper reported that German unions and some German politicians are balking about reducing imports of Russian natural gas because they said it would cost jobs and whatnot. I expect to hear the same thing from American voters if prices don't come down. Virtue doesn't come cheap. Dietrich Bonhoeffer used to talk about what he called cheap grace. Real grace isn't cheap, but selfishness and self-seeking cost more in the long run. Democracies don't excel in long runs thinking, especially our own. People's attention span is short. And I'm afraid that, this is hurting my pocketbook. It costs too much for gas. Boo-hoo, boo-hoo. And then there'll be this gradual sapping of support for the Ukrainians. Well, it's too bad for them, but I got to fill my gas tank, or I don't want to pay more at the grocery store and whatnot. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot fade when times get rough. We have to see whether we have the stick-to-itiveness as a society to sustain the long twilight struggle, as John F. Kennedy once called it, or whether we're going to cave in. And if we do, we'll pay for it dearly down the line. It's been pointed out that, Putin leaned on Georgia, and stole some of his land. The United States and the West responded weakly when they did horrible things in Syria. We didn't really do much. Obama's famous red line that was crossed, and then nothing happened. Then Crimea is taken, and again the response is weak. And the Donbass, the same thing. So then, are we to be surprised when, after having this series of cheap victories, and it's a series of them, this man thought, I can get away with anything. These people will put up with anything. Well, now, of course, he overestimated himself and underestimated the West. But the danger is always there that, our domestic opposition will cause what's called the effort against him to collapse. We have to show whether we'll have to show what kind of a people we are. And the West will have to show what kind of people they are. Dr. Rizzo has already pointed out about Viktor Orban in Hungary. There were a number of right-wing politicians in the United States who love Vladimir Putin because he fights their battles in the culture wars. He's against gay rights. He's against feminism. He's against irreligion. Immigration. all of these things, which in his mind, point to the decadence of the West. And this all has a very familiar ring, does it not? Which is why some of the opposition, even in the United States, against Putin, that has to be raised because of Ukraine, it's been an embarrassed one. And these weaknesses lie there in the society and can be exploited for evil at this point. Just bring up something here. Putin's not really fighting Ukraine. The Polish foreign minister said he's really fighting the West. Ukraine is the battleground. It's the values of the West that are under attack because he doesn't care that much about NATO in actuality. What he's afraid of is that a democratic Ukraine linked to Europe, that's a threat to his position and to everything that he stands for. And only the Chinese also as well. That's what he's trying to stop. And whether we can recognize that and fight the battle on those terms is going to determine the future.
I think those are very, very good points. I'd like to backtrack for a second, though, and touch on something Dr. Rizova had mentioned earlier, that being the domestic climate inside Russia. And we have seen video from Russian, basically state-controlled media, and it seems like nowadays they're either not talking about the war at all, or they have talking heads on who are assuring the Russians who are watching that, victory is at hand. But at the same time, the Russians are starting to see the casualties, the soldiers killed in action coming back home to be buried. And that, of course, really drives home the reality of war once and for all, regardless of what the talking heads are saying on state-controlled TV. I guess what I'm asking is this. As casualties mount, as the economic squeeze continues, will we reach a point when the Russians begin to turn on Putin, or has he so emasculated the political opposition in that country that really there's nobody, even the oligarchs, even the security agencies, even the military, who has the ability to step up and take him on and potentially depose him?
I think that will definitely reach a point at which the majority of the Russian population will turn against Putin's regime. And I want to be very emphatic about it. It's not just about Putin himself, but about the entire set of institutions he has been able to set up and sustain for such a long time. I recently read a very interesting interview with Polish historian Adam Mechnik, in which he said, look, the situation between comparing the USSR invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and the current situation with the invasion of Ukraine is very different. Back in 1968, there was a record of 7 people in the Soviet Union protesting against the war, against the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now we have at least 8,000 who have been arrested for protests against the war. So the scale of opposition and protests is certainly fairly impressive for a country like Russia, where state media dominates the narrative, where propaganda is so powerful. I think eventually the economic pain will be so substantial that people will no longer be able to ignore the economic reality. And I think there are plenty of people in Russia with a conscience. I think right now there's something like 200,000 Russians who have fled the country because they oppose the invasion. So the more difficult question to answer, in my opinion, is how soon will that happen? Will it be a matter of months? Will it be a matter of a year or 2? That the time frame, I think, is a little bit harder to predict, but eventually we will get to that point.
And in that same vein, we know that one institution within Russia that has been a prominent backer of Putin and his policies has been the Russian Orthodox Church. But now we're seeing some Orthodox congregations in the West that are breaking with Moscow over this issue. Orthodox congregations in the U.S. and elsewhere very much opposed to the war and don't like the idea of the church hierarchy backing Putin so openly and basically endorsing what could be interpreted as a genocide inside Ukraine. What do you think this means long term for the Russian Orthodox Church? Are we going to see some kind of a permanent schism or break between the mother church back in Russia and congregations in the West over the Ukraine issue?
From my last presentation, you know that the Russian church has always supported the person in power and has been a supporter of autocratic government. This is historically the case, and it continues on now. Furthermore, the kind of culture wars that I described before, Putin has placed himself on the side of very conservative Christian thinking on this, which reflects the thinking of the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church at its topmost level. Gay pride parades seem to be a bugaboo in the head of Metropolitan Kirill and those around him. But the whole idea of the homosexual lifestyle, if you will, the gay agenda, whatever scare terms you might want to use, has driven them absolutely up the wall. The Russians even have this term for Europe or the West, gay-ropa, as opposed to Europa, as a slur for this kind of thing. So those leaders, because he supports that, they're not likely to break with him. And yet, as you pointed out in your question, a number of congregations outside of Russia itself, Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, have in fact said they cannot support this position. They cannot support the position in the Russian government's taken in Ukraine. But not all. Some have opposed it. A goodly number have just stayed silent. They're embarrassed. They don't say anything at all. And then, of course, there are those who have continued to support Putin. There's been some splits in some congregations, with people walking out of them, and in a couple of cases, the whole church turning against its leader. There's not likely to be a wholesale religious revolt against Putin. But Dr. Rizova's previous comments on domestic opposition, I'm somewhat less optimistic than she is about the strength of this, so she just we're looking into it. But in Afghanistan, when the casualties reached a certain point, then it began to have a real influence on public opinion. I think if the Ukrainians make this war very, very expensive for the Russians, if what happens in Donbass turns out to be, a victorious bloodbath with thousands upon thousands of casualties going home, I think that could be the bale of hay that breaks the camel's back as far as domestic opposition. And she's right about what surprises me about the amount of domestic opposition we've seen in Russia so far is that it's mostly the young generation who've known nothing but Putin. And yet, with all that, they've turned against him. So you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time. But apparently Putin's financial, you can't fool all the people all of the time, even if they grew up under you.
I have a couple of comments. One has to do with the Orthodox Church, which I will make first. So I think, Gary, you're absolutely right when you say that there are already differences in how various Orthodox churches around the world are treating the issue with the war in Ukraine. I recently read about the reaction of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, which has traditionally had close ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. And while there has not been an outright rejection, and of course, expression of disapproval and criticism of the invasion of Ukraine, the Bulgarian patriarch did give a prayer, pre-Easter prayer, since Bulgarian Easter, Orthodox Easter is coming up, in which he said that he was hoping that God will put enough sense of sympathy and empathy in the minds of those who are responsible for the invasion to prevent them from doing so any further. So it's not really a direct criticism of the invasion, but it's an indirect expression of disapproval of the actions of the Russian government. The second comment that I wanted to make ties back to our earlier question of estimating the level of support for the Russian war effort in Ukraine. If we were to look at the polls, one thing that we have to always be very careful about is how questions are posed. And in a country like Russia, it really makes a difference, and in any country, in fact, it makes a difference how the question has been posed. If you were to pose the question directly, to the Russian respondent, do you support the war? Then the level of support is near the 70% mark. So there is still a number of people, about 30% of respondents, who would say that they're not supportive of the war. However, if you were to pose the question indirectly, and this was actually done by a group of scholars from the London School of Economics, who came up with this really interesting experiment that allowed them to estimate the real level of support for the war, it is closer to the 50% mark. I won't go into details how this experiment was conducted, because that goes beyond the scope of our conversation, but suffice it to say, Russian official polls, even the independent pollsters of Russia, have overestimated the level of support for the war itself because of how the survey questions are posed.
More of our conversation on Ukraine in just a moment, but right now a message for those of you leaving the service in the months ahead. How would you like to earn an in-demand skill before you enter the civilian job market, and at virtually no cost to you? I'm referring to the SkillBridge Welding Training Program at Thomas Nelson. Now, as the name indicates, it's part of the military's SkillBridge program, which allows transitioning personnel to spend up to 16 weeks in an education, training, OJT, or credentialing program during their last 6 months on active duty. It's aimed at helping you acquire new skills and enhancing your employability in the civilian world. Now, the welding program at TNCC is only 5 weeks in length. You can choose from morning, afternoon, or evening sessions, and you'll earn a certification in shielded metal arc welding, which can help you land a job as a welding trainee. And if you do well in the program, and most of our military students do very well, you'll be encouraged to apply for a position with Newport News Shipbuilding, offering great pay and benefits from day one. And best of all, the cost of the program is paid by Virginia Career Works and the TNCC Educational Foundation. Learn more by calling the military team here at Thomas Nelson. Our phone number is 757-825-2938. Or you can email me, that's pounderg, Pounderg, at tncc.edu. Get ready for your new civilian career at Thomas Nelson, becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College. Looking ahead, but before I do that, I want to ask you about an event that got a lot of attention, both militarily and in terms of media coverage over the last week, and that was the sinking of the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva. Ukrainians mounted just simply a brilliant operation. Apparently, they put a couple of drones up over the area that the cruiser was operating in. The crew became distracted. The Ukrainians, who actually built the ship for the Russians back in the 1970s, knew about some weaknesses in the Moskva's defense, launched anti-ship cruise missiles from shore. Apparently, the Russian crew never detected it. At least 2 missiles hit the ship. Their efforts at damage control firefighting were unsuccessful. And reportedly, about 2 hours later, the ship went down with apparently a heavy loss of life. And again, this is something that's gotten world attention. What kind of an impact do you think the loss of a ship like that is going to have on the Russians psychologically? Does it have any impact on the domestic calculus that we were talking about there a moment ago?
I certainly think that this is a major loss. In fact, the Russian government merely stated, as far as I understand, that the cause of the sinking was a fire on board, but they haven't really specified or been transparent about what caused the fire itself. And again, from what I understand, the claim is that every single crew member has been saved, which is probably not true. I cannot imagine that a ship that sinks will have actually meant that every single life on board was safe. So I'm not really likely to give any credibility to the Russian reports. The impact, I definitely think, is going to be, it will undermine Russian morale, especially the soldiers who are fighting on behalf of their country.
Looking ahead, as the war continues, and obviously, again, we discussed earlier, NATO remains, I would say, fairly unified, strongly unified, in fact, in supporting the Ukrainians. What should NATO's actions be in the week ahead, both in terms of providing military support for the Ukrainian government and also in terms of their political stand against the war and supporting, again, the government there in Kyiv?
Well, so far I think the Biden administration, and I'm repeating the comments here of other commentators, has done a superb job in keeping NATO together and in the level of support that it's given to the Ukrainians. Some of it quite overt, for instance, the increase of the size of the howitzers that are now being supplied to the Ukrainian military. They have heavier weapons than before, armored personnel carriers, etc. As for the much discussed subject of how about sending them those MiGs that the Poles have, we have said, of course, that in the past we have disproved it. We have fallen silent on the subject, and with the rather evasive comment, well, what individual countries do is up to them, which sounds to me like a big fat loophole, meaning they're going to get the MiGs. They'll be shipped across the border to that. I think we need to continue to supply the weapons to the Ukrainians to help them to continue to fight this out. Only if they can maintain a solid resistance against the Russians have they any chance for any kind of anything like a reasonable outcome to in any possible negotiations. So keep up the good work is what I say. And the strengthening of of American forces in those countries as a signal to the Russians as to don't try any funny business, like trying to do something to a NATO member. Although as I already said, the Russians are right now have their hands full trying to handle the Ukrainians, and it's probably going to walk over. I don't think they're going to try to take on NATO forces at this particular juncture. That would be beyond improvement.
And a final question for both of you. I will ask you now to kind of gaze in your crystal balls. Where do you think this conflict is going to be in roughly 6 weeks, say the end of May? What do you think the situation on the ground is going to look like? What do you think the situation is going to look like politically for the Russians, for the Ukrainians, and for NATO?
So I definitely think that Russia's intention is to secure several key victories. And I think it has identified Donbass as the place to secure these victories. That is not surprising, first of all, because of geography and because of the fact that they already have the separatists inside the region on their side as well. So in the next 6 weeks, I do see the conquest of several key cities in the region, in spite of the brave defensive effort of Ukraine. However, there are always possibilities for twists. This is a war, and it could very well be the case that the Ukrainian defense forces will be able to mount the kind of opposition they need to push away the troops and lead to another attempt on behalf of the Russian forces to reorganize, regroup, and return for another offensive. So while I hope that will not be the outcome, I think there will be some victories for Russia. The economic impact will be felt more and more over the next 6 weeks. There's already a scarcity of a lot of basic necessities in Russia. With the pullout of so many international companies, people are losing jobs. We're talking about jobs in the thousands. Even though some of them are still getting paid by their employers, I think eventually that will stop. And the Russian government will simply not have enough time and resources, most likely, to retrain all of these individuals and find them jobs. So I think the economic impact will increase the pain on the Russian population, which will just motivate the Russian government to intensify its propaganda campaign, With the increase in the number of body bags returning to Russia, however, that propaganda will be less and less effective. So if you were to think about all the factors coming together, what I do foresee is a weakening of the level of support in Russia and an intensification on behalf of the Russian government to boost morale in whatever way it can, including with lies and deceit, which are the trademark of the Russian government.
Dr. Mazzarella, your forecast for where you think this conflict is going to be at the end of May?
Cloudy with chance of thunderstorms. May 9th is the date that the Russians celebrate their victory over Nazi Germany. It could be used by Putin to declare victory based on something like the taking of Mariupol, for instance. And that might provide if he decided to cut his losses, that might provide an opening for real negotiations. But what they would be, I can't imagine. I think the Russians would like to take the provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk the parts that they hold or held before February were only part of those provinces. I think they would like to take at least the entirety of those provinces. Whether they will be able to do that depends partly on the military outcome. But truthfully, if the Ukrainians can continue their resistance, and again, this has to be proven, the situation is going to change. The Russian forces will be completely concentrated. They'll be on terrain more to the liking of their own tactics and whatnot. And it may be that the string of Ukrainian successes will come to an end, or will be muchly diminished. But if they can continue the resistance, I expect the war is going to drag on. And as I said before, we historians are very bad about predicting the future.
Indeed, indeed. I want to thank you again, both of you, for taking time to appear on the podcast. Your insights, your analysis is always fascinating. I always learn a great deal, and it really provides, I think, some valuable insight for our audience in terms of not only what's going on, what we see, what we hear about, but what's actually going on behind the scenes, some of the motivating factors and things like that have prompted this crisis and continue to drive this conflict there in Eastern Europe. We've been talking with Dr. Tatiana Rizova and Dr. Mario Mazzarella from Christopher Newport University about the conflict in Ukraine, and I hope we can have you back here in about 6 weeks because, unfortunately, it looks like the war will probably still be going on at that time. This has been At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. For our producer, Jim Worthy, I'm Gary Pounder. Thanks for listening.